This is a video lesson, number 23, cookie time, proportional reasoning with a recipe. So every recipe, here's a typical one shown here, chocolate chip cookies, requires certain quantities of ingredients. And in reality, it's not that you need to use precisely these quantities, but they must be in proportion with each other for you to get tasty cookies. In this case, I made the recipe in different units of measurement. There are cups of flour, a teaspoon baking soda, 200 grams of butter. This is common in Europe, but not in America, to actually weigh your ingredients. And we'll be using these units of measurements to do some proportional reasoning. We'll make some calculations. So you'll want your calculator if you haven't got it out already. The first question we have on the paper is designed to be a very easy question. It says, suppose you make only 2 dozen cookies, how many grams of butter would be required? So this is something I'm hoping you can do in your head. Maybe you can even look at it right now, pause the tape, and get an answer before I show you. You can see that the original recipe makes 4 dozen cookies. 2 dozen would therefore be half a recipe. The original recipe, 200 grams of butter. What's half of that? 100 grams of butter. And I can put a little reasoning here as well as an answer. Notice I'm being very clear in my answer. Not just saying 100, I'm saying 100 grams of butter. And the reasoning would be it's a half recipe. So always in science, the reasoning is important. You're trying to convince somebody that this is a valid method. In this case, it's a very simple method. The second question here is a little more complicated. We'll need a calculator to do this well, and we'll need to set up a proportion. You'll notice I have 1, 2, 3, 4 slots. One of them will be an unknown x. The other 3 must be known quantities. The other thing to notice is that everything has a label. This will be cups of flour, these numbers here. This 375 is grams of sugar. You should understand where that 375 comes from. It's up here in the original recipe. Here's 375 grams of sugar. Therefore, this number here in this first blank should be the cups of flour that correspond to the 375 grams of sugar. In other words, what's the original recipe say? So the original recipe says that it is 2 1/4 cups of flour that correspond to 375 grams of sugar. So here in my proportion, I will line up 2 1/4, which I will write as 2.25 for simplicity on the calculator. 2 1/4 cups of flour corresponds to 375 grams of sugar. That line there is the original recipe. The second line of my proportion, the bottom half of these fractions, of these ratios, will be the modified recipe. This says, suppose you want to use 3 1/2 cups of flour instead of the 2 1/4 cups mentioned in the original recipe. That 3 1/2 would go here. I'll write it as 3.5 cups of flour. Corresponds to some unknown number of grams of sugar, some unknown quantity of sugar. Let's calculate the appropriate amount of sugar. And this will be best done using a calculator. Now I will actually do the calculation using my calculator. This part B suggests you can cross multiply and then use appropriate algebra to solve for the value of x. Here's my cross multiplication. I have 2.25 x equals 3.5 times 375. So that's where I'll get my calculator out and we'll simplify this value right here. I'm now using my calculator. I'll do the multiplication here. 3 1/2 times 375 gets me it's 1312.5 is equal to 2.25x. To get x by itself, I will divide both sides by 2 1/4. So I'll show this as an intermediate step here over 2.25. So this is x will be equal to 1312.5 divided by 2.25. I have an answer on my calculator that says x equals 583.3, and I need a label on that. If you just say x equals 583.3, that has no meaning whatsoever in terms of our recipe. But if we then say, what does that stand for? What does x represent? X represents the grams of sugar. So this 583.3 is grams of sugar. And that is the quantity that I should be weighing out to go with my 3½ cups of flour. The right ratio for 3½ cups of flour is 583.3 grams of sugar. This last question on the page doesn't have any template, so it's asking you to set up your own proportion to calculate how many ounces of chocolate chips would be needed to make a big batch of cookies using a pound of butter. So once again, you try to set up a proportion on your own before you copy me. Make sure in your proportion that every value has a label. These are not just numbers, they are representing, for example, ounces of chocolate chips and should be appropriately labeled in the proportion. Here's my proportion. Drawing big long lines so I can have nice labels on them. I know that the ratio I'm looking at is ounces of chocolate chips and grams of butter. So I'll already go ahead and do that. In this case, I'll set up my proportion a little differently than I did before. I'll say there is a known ratio of grams of butter to ounces, OZ is ounces, of chocolate chips. And this, for me, will be the original recipe. Original recipe. So there are different ways to do your proportion. This is one way that will work well. And then the other side will be the modified recipe. Modified recipe, where I have keep the same proportions, but I use different quantities than the original. Okay, but when I do that, I know that the labels must line up. This should be grams of butter on the top to line up with grams of butter on the other side. And this will be ounces of chocolate chips, so that that also lines up with the label on the other side. So doing it this way, I have structure even without numbers. 3 of these blanks should be filled with numbers and 1 should be an X. So the original recipe, there are no unknowns. So I'll go up to the original recipe and I'll say, what does it say about chocolate chips and butter? It says 12 ounces of chocolate chips corresponds to 200 grams of butter. So I'll put that now into my proportion. 200 grams of butter corresponds to 12 ounces of chocolate chips. That's the original recipe. The other side here now will have an X and a number. The X will be the question. How many ounces of chocolate chips? I don't know. Let's let that be X. And the known is we are using 1 pound of butter. That's 454 grams of butter. So this is now a proportion that I can solve using cross multiplication. And once again, try to get an answer before I show you the answer. Here's my algebra. I have 200x equals 12 times 454 and then it's calculator time. 454 times 12, 5448, and that equals 200x. So I divide by 200 to get my answer. X equals 27.24. The label on this number, I can go back to my proportion, and the label on this number is ounces of chocolate chips. Ounces of chocolate chips. That's the one I can put a circle around it and say, this, I've answered the question. If you think about it, this should make perfect sense to you. 454 grams of butter is a little more than double the original recipe. 27 ounces is a little more than double the original recipe. So it's always a good idea to think about your answer. Does it make sense? Is it reasonable? In this case, I am satisfied that this is a perfectly reasonable answer to the question. Some take-home messages. Every number gets a label. I'll say that a few hundred times this year. Learn it the first time, please. Secondly, the labels line up. They either line up vertically, here cups of flour line up, or they line up horizontally, grams of butter on the left, grams of butter on the right. They cannot line up on the diagonal. That's the only way to run your proportion where it won't work.